Clean my boots. He said it the way another man might ask for coffee. No heat in it. That was the part I'd spent a long time trying to forget, that there was no heat in it at all. Major Alan Deming stood on the duckboards outside the operations tent with one boot up on an ammo crate, the toe caked in the gray Dunmore mud that got into everything, and he looked down at the woman in front of him the way you'd look at a stain on a floor you were about to have someone else scrub. I was standing 3 feet to his left with a clipboard I didn't need, because that was where a good operations chief stood, and I said nothing. I want that on the record before I say anything else. I said nothing. Her name on the manifest I'd printed that morning read VANCE, N, MSGT, ATT. The last 3 letters meant attachment, meant somebody the base was stuck with and not somebody the base had asked for, and to Major Deming an attachment was a house guest who hadn't been invited and wouldn't stop tracking mud. She was maybe 5'6", dark hair cut short and practical under a soft cover, utilities worn pale at the knees and elbows the way a working uniform goes, no ribbons because you don't wear ribbons on utilities, no swagger, nothing about her that asked for a second look. She had a way of standing that I registered without understanding it, weight even on both feet, hands loose, shoulders down, eyes level. I'd learned later that men who defuse bombs stand like that because a startled man is a man who moves, and a man who moves is a man who dies, and the body learns to keep still long before the mind decides to. She tracked mud into the operations tent. That was the whole crime. She'd come in with a routing slip that needed the major's signature, and her boots had left 2 prints on the plywood, and Major Deming, who believed with the whole of his heart that a clean base was a disciplined base, and a disciplined base was a base that lived, had decided to make an example. "Master Sergeant," he said, "do you see my floor?" "I see it, sir." "Do you see what's on my floor?" "Mud, sir, mine. I'll square it away." "You'll square it away." He nodded slowly like she'd said something wise, and then he took his boot down off the crate and set both feet apart and pointed at the mud on his own toe. "You'll start here, clean my boots, then you'll do the floor. There's a brush in the chief's kit." He looked at me. "Staff Sergeant, the brush." And I got the brush. I want that on the record too. I walked to the field desk, and I took the boot brush out of Gunnery Sergeant Occam's cleaning kit where it lived in a coffee can, and I carried it back across the tent, and I held it out, and I did not look at her when I did it. I looked at the major, because looking at the major was easier, and because for 11 months Major Deming had been the axis my whole world turned on, and a man doesn't cross his axis over a boot brush. She took the brush from my hand. Her fingers were cool and dry and steady. She looked at it for a second, not the brush, I think, but something past it, and then she went down onto one knee in the mud in front of the major of a forward Marine base, in front of the 2 lieutenants and the 4 Marines who drifted to the tent flap to watch, and she began to clean his boots. She did it well. That was the thing that put the first small crack in me, though I didn't know it was a crack yet. She didn't do it fast and sloppy to get it over with, and she didn't do it slow and sullen to make him feel it. She braced the boot with one hand at the heel and worked the brush along the welt in even strokes, the mud coming off in curls, and when the toe was clean she buffed it with the heel of her palm until the leather took a dull shine, and she did the other boot the same way, and the whole time her face held nothing at all. Not shame, not anger, nothing you could hang a hook on. It was the face of a woman doing a task, and the task happened to be kneeling in the mud of a Marine base, cleaning the boots of a man who outranked her by 3 grades and outmattered her by none. Behind me, one of the lance corporals laughed. It came out of him half swallowed, the way a laugh does when a man isn't sure he's allowed, and then Corporal Hicks laughed with him because Hicks laughed at whatever the room laughed at, and then it was a low, ugly ripple of it around the tent flap, 4 or 5 men laughing at a kneeling woman, and Major Deming let it happen. He stood there and let it happen and looked down at her with something that wasn't even cruelty, that was worse than cruelty, that was a kind of satisfied tidiness, a man watching a mess get cleaned up. "There," he said when she'd buffed the second toe. "Was that so hard?" "No, sir." She stood. She held the brush out to me, not to him, and I took it back, and our eyes met for exactly 1 second, and there was nothing in hers I could use. No plea. No hate. She'd catalogued me. That's the only word I've ever found for it. She'd looked at me the way you look at a piece of terrain you're going to have to cross later, filing where the soft ground was. "Sign her slip," Deming told me, and turned back to his maps, and the show was over. I signed her routing slip. She left. The mud on the plywood was still there. Nobody made her do the floor after all, because the floor had never been the point. I stood holding a boot brush and a clipboard, and I felt the first thin thread of a feeling I didn't have a name for yet, and I put it down where I put things I didn't want to carry, and I went back to work. Let me tell you about the world that made a boot brush possible, because if you don't understand the world, you'll think the Major was a monster, and he wasn't a monster. That would be easier. He was worse than a monster. He was a competent man with a narrow idea of what competence looked like, and the idea had a woman-shaped hole in it. Camp Dunmore sat on a plateau of gray grit at the edge of a valley whose name I won't give because the men who died there deserve better than to have it in a story. We were a logistics and fires hub, an ammunition supply point that fed 3 outposts, a fuel farm, a motor pool, an aid station that handled everything the outposts couldn't, and a rotating company of Marines to hold the wire. Major Deming ran it, and he ran it clean. I mean that as praise and as an indictment both, because both are true, and a man is allowed to be 2 things. Under Deming, the burn barrels were labeled. The fighting positions were dressed and swept. The duty roster was posted in a laminated sleeve and never once, in 11 months, wrong. He believed, and here I'll defend him, because a dead man can't defend himself and I owe him at least an honest accounting. He believed that entropy was the enemy that killed you when the other enemy wasn't looking. He'd been at a base once, early in his career, that got sloppy, and the sloppiness let a truck through a gate that shouldn't have let it through, and men he knew were still in that ground. So he made his base tight. He made it tight the way a frightened man makes a fist, and he'd been rewarded for it up the chain for so long that nobody had ever told him the cost. The cost was that Major Deming's Marines had learned to read the base the way he read it, which is to say as a thing to be kept tidy, and a woman attached from an outfit he didn't recognize, wearing a rate on her manifest he didn't respect, was a species of untidiness. He didn't hate her because she was a woman. I've thought about this for years, and I'll say it plainly. It wasn't that simple, and it wasn't that clean. It was that his idea of a Marine had a shape, and she didn't fit the shape, and the not fitting registered in him as a lapse in discipline, and Major Deming corrected lapses in discipline. That she happened to be a woman just meant the correction had an audience that would laugh. I was his instrument. Staff Sergeant Wade Kessler, Operations Chief, 34 years old, 11 years in, a man who'd found in Deming's tidiness a kind of home. My own life had not been tidy, I'll leave that where it is, and there was something in the laminated roster and the swept positions that felt like safety to me, and I served the man who provided it, and I did not ask what the safety cost other people. That's the confession under all the other confessions. I liked the order, and I didn't count who paid for it. So when she came, I saw her the way he taught me to see, an attachment, a slip that needed signing, a pair of boots on my plywood that weren't cleaning themselves. She'd arrived 4 days before the boot brush, on the resupply bird, with a single sea bag and a hard black case she carried herself and wouldn't let the working party touch. I noticed the case because she was careful with it in a way she wasn't careful with anything else, and I filed that and forgot it. Her records hadn't caught up. That happened with attachments, the paperwork chasing the person across 3 commands. So what we had on her was a name, a rate, and the letters ATT. And into that vacuum Major Deming poured his assumptions and I poured mine. She kept to herself those first days. Took a rack in the transient tent. Ate at the far end of the mess with her cover off and her eyes down. Not sullen, just contained. A woman who'd learned to take up exactly as much room as she needed and not 1 inch past. She ran mornings the perimeter road inside the wire alone in a gray shirt gone dark with sweat, and she ran the way she stood, economical, no wasted motion, the same pace start to finish like something metered. Hicks made a comment about it once in the ops tent and I let it stand. Because letting Hicks's comments stand was cheaper than correcting them, and I was, above all, a man who did the cheap thing. The friction started small. It always does. On her second day she went to the ammo supply point, the ASP we called it, the beating heart of the base and the reason any of us were there. And she went inside the wire of it without checking in through the major's ops tent first, which was a real breach, a genuine one. You don't wander an ASP, and Sergeant Bell, who ran the point, radioed it up and Deming came down hard. She stood the reaming without a word. Said only, "Understood, sir. My error." But I was there, and I watched her while Deming talked, and her eyes never stopped moving across that ammo point, the stacks, the spacing, the earthen revetments between the pads. The fuel Bowser parked a lazy 40 meters closer to the ordnance than it should have been. She was reading it. She was reading the ASP the way I read the duty roster, like it was a thing with a right answer and a wrong one. And I remember thinking, with the small contempt I'd been trained into, what does an attachment know about an ammo point? I'd have my answer inside the week. It would cost me everything I thought I knew about who on that base was keeping us alive. The morning of the boots, she'd been coming from the ASP again, checked in properly this time, everything by the book, carrying that routing slip, and she'd tracked her mud, and Major Deming had made her kneel. And I'd fetched the brush. Here is what I didn't see, because I was looking at the Major. I didn't see the two older Marines at the back of the crowd who did not laugh. Staff Sergeant Reyes from the motor pool, and a wiry gunny named Pratt who ran the 8-station security detail. Two men with the long service and the flat eyes of people who'd been where the ribbons come from, and they stood at the back and they did not laugh. And one of them, Reyes, took a half step forward when she went down on her knee, and Pratt put a hand on his arm and stopped him. I didn't see it. Reyes told me about it later in the dark, both of us unable to sleep. "I knew that stance, Kessler," he said. "The second she took a knee, I knew that stance. I just couldn't place the face yet." He'd carried the not placing around all day like a stone in his boot. That night I lay in my rack and the thin thread of feeling came back, and this time it wouldn't put down. It wasn't guilt exactly. I wasn't a good enough man yet for guilt. It was more that a small, quiet part of me, the part Deming's order hadn't paved over, kept replaying the way she'd buffed that boot toe until it shined. A person who wanted to shame you back would have done a bad job. A person who wanted to defy you would have done a slow job. She'd done a good job, fast and complete, and then handed the brush back and stood. And there was a discipline in it that was harder than the Major's discipline, harder and quieter and entirely her own. And some animal part of me recognized it, and was uneasy in its presence the way you're uneasy near a bigger animal that hasn't moved. I didn't have the word for it. The word was respect, and it would be 3 days before I was forced to say it out loud, and I would be forced to say it, all of us would, by a thing that fell out of the sky and did not go off. The wire went hot on a Thursday, in the flat gray hour before dusk when the light goes the color of the mud, and everything on the base looks like it's been dipped in the same tin. I was in the ops tent with the Major and Gunny Ockham, going over the next day's convoy manifest, when the first rocket came in. You hear them before the alarm, always a rushing tear in the sky like fabric ripping over your head, and then the crump, and then the ground kicks you in the soles of your feet, and only then does some Marine on the wire get to the siren, and it starts its late useless wail. The first one hit long, out past the fuel farm, a gout of dirt going up black against the gray, and the second hit shorter, and I understood in the animal part of my brain that they were walking them in, correcting fire, some spotter out in the valley adjusting each shot closer, and the ASP was the thing worth walking them toward. "Incoming, incoming, take cover," the base net said, which is the kind of thing the net says when the thing has already happened. Deming was already moving, and I'll give him this. Under fire, the man was not a coward. He grabbed his helmet and his rifle and he went out into it, shouting men toward the bunkers, counting heads, doing the hard, sane work of a commander who wants his people in the ground and not in the open. I went with him. Akem went the other way toward the fire's desk. The base came apart into its practice pieces, the way a well-drilled base does. Marines pouring into the reinforced bunkers, the aid station buttoning up, Sergeant Bell's crew at the ASP scrambling to get behind the revetments. The rockets kept coming. 4, 5, 6. I lost the count. Everybody always loses the count. One took the corner off the transient tent and threw a rack 20 feet. One cratered the motor pool apron and set a 5-ton burning, and the black smoke of it rolled low across the base and turned the gray light greasy and orange. We were pressed against the sandbag wall of the ops bunker, Deming with the handset screaming for counter-battery. And through the smoke I watched the 7th rocket come in, and I watched where it went, and my heart stopped in my chest. It came down between the aid station and the ammo point. In the open ground, the killing ground, the 40 meters of gray grit that separated the place, where we kept our wounded from the place, where we kept enough high explosive to erase the base off the plateau. It came down at a shallow angle and it hit, and it did not go off. It skidded. I saw it skid, a long dark shape throwing up a rooster tail of grit, and it fetched up half buried at an angle in the dirt maybe 15 meters from the nearest ammunition pad and 20 from the aid station wall, and it sat there. Fins up, smoking faintly from the motor. A dud. A rocket the size of a grown man that had come to kill us and had, by the arithmetic of a bad fuse or a soft angle of impact, failed too for now. Dud, somebody screamed. Dud on the ASP road. Here is what a dud is, and I didn't know it that day. I learned it in the next 40 minutes standing closer to one than I ever want to stand again. A dud is not safe. A dud is a bomb that has failed to explode yet. The fuse that should have functioned on impact didn't, which means the fuse is now in an unknown state, armed and delicate, or damaged and unpredictable, nobody on the outside of it can say. And this one was still smoking from its rocket motor, which meant heat, and heat near high explosive starts a clock. If the residual propellant cooked, or if the warhead's filler reached its cook-off temperature from the motor burn, or from the burning 5-ton drifting its smoke across the base, the thing would function. And it was 15 meters from a pad stacked with artillery rounds, which would sympathetically detonate, which would take the next pad, and the next, and there is a word for what happens when an entire ASP goes at once, and the word is that there is no aid station anymore, no ops tent, no bunkers close enough, no motor pool, no major, no boot brush, no me. Camp Dunmore would be a black scar and a crater and a list of names read somewhere far away. The counter battery must have worked, or the spotter ran because the rocket stopped. The silence after was worse than the noise. Into that silence the base began to understand, position by position, what was sitting on the ASP road. "Where's EOD?" Deming said, not shouting now, very quiet. "Where is Chief Alvarin?" Chief Alvarin was the base EOD lead, a Navy explosive ordnance disposal chief attached to us for exactly this, a good man, and the word came back down the net in pieces, and the pieces were bad. Alvarin had been near the motor pool when the 5-ton went up. He was alive. He was also under the collapsed edge of a revetment with his leg broken in 2 places, and a scalp wound pouring blood into his eyes, being dragged into the aid station right then by 2 of his own techs. And his 2 techs were junior, months in, qualified to assist, and not one of them qualified to walk up alone to a smoking warhead 15 meters from a live ammunition pad and take it apart with their hands. I watched Major Deming understand that his base was going to die. I watched it move across his face in the greasy orange light. He was a competent man, and competence includes knowing the edge of your competence. And he knew, we all knew, that there was no one on Camp Dunmore who could walk out onto that road and make that thing safe, and that we could not wait for another team to fly in because the clock was the motor smoke and the drifting fire and it was already running. Everybody back, he was saying. Get everybody back to the far wire, and he was already doing the only math he had, which was how many he could save by how far he could pull them, and it wasn't enough. You can't outrun an asp, and I saw him know that too. And a voice beside me said, Chief Alvarin carries a Mark 7 kit. Where is it? She'd come from the direction of the aid station. Master Sergeant Vance. She had that hard black case in one hand, the one she'd carried off the bird herself and wouldn't let anyone touch. And she was looking not at the major but at the dud, and she was reading it, her eyes doing the thing I'd seen at the ammo point, moving across it and the ground and the smoke and the pad beyond it, and her face was doing the nothing it had done under the boot brush, the exact same nothing, and I understood in a rush that went through me like cold water that it was not nothing at all. It was the most total concentration I had ever seen on a human face. It only looked like nothing because everything was pointed inward at the problem, and none of it was left over for show. Master Sergeant, Deming said, get to the back wire. His kit, she said again level, Alvarin's kit, where? That's not Deming started, and Gunny Pratt, the wiry one from the aid station, the one who hadn't laughed, came out of the smoke half carrying a green Pelican case and said, Here, it's here. I pulled it off him, and he set it down at her feet, and he looked at her and he said, Stillwater, it's you. I thought it was you, and something passed between them that I didn't understand yet. She'd already opened her own black case. Inside, nested in foam, was a set of tools I didn't have names for then, and have since learned to respect more than almost anything men make. Non-sparking, wrenches the color of brass, hook-hand line gear. A small, precise kit of things designed by people who'd thought very hard about how to touch a bomb and live. She was pulling a heavy apron and collar rig over her head, not the big bulky suit you see in pictures. There was no time for the suit, and the suit wouldn't matter at this range against this much filler. And she knew it. And she put on the collar and the apron anyway because a professional does the professional things even when the professional things won't save her, because the doing of them keeps the hands calm. Sir, she looked at Deming now, full in the face the first time. I am going to walk out there and render that safe. I need the base pulled back past the motor pool to the far revetments, not because it'll save them if I fail, it won't, but because I don't want anyone close enough to make me think about them. I need the fire on that 5-ton knocked down or contained because its smoke is heating my problem. And I need one man to run my kit and my line and do exactly what I say when I say it and nothing else. Not a volunteer, an order, pick your steadiest hands. And Major Deming, the man who had made her kneel in the mud 3 days before, stood in the orange light with his mouth slightly open, and he did not have an answer, because everything about the last 3 days had prepared him to be the man with the answer, and he had just met the edge of himself. And past that edge stood a woman he'd handed a boot brush. Kessler, she said, not the major, me. She'd catalogued me on the first day, filed where the soft ground was, and now she called the soft ground by name. You fetch the brush. You've got steady hands or you couldn't hold a clipboard that still while a man does something ugly. You'll do, gloves on. You touch nothing I don't tell you to touch. If I say run, you run and you do not look back, and that is not me being brave, that is me needing to know you'll obey the one order that matters. Yes or no. Now. I have asked myself many times why I said yes. It wasn't courage. I want to be honest in this account, and courage is not a thing I had that day. I found some later and I'm not sure I've kept it. I think I said yes because for 3 days a small paved-over part of me had been ashamed, and here was the one currency that could buy the shame back, and I was greedy for it. I said, yes, Master Sergeant. Then move. Deming found his voice. To his lasting credit, and I will give the dead their due, he did not fight her. He looked at the dud and he looked at her tools, and he was a competent man meeting a competence larger than his own, and he did the hardest thing a proud man can do, which is nothing, which is to get out of the way. Do what she says, he told the net horse. All positions pull back to the far revetments. Pratt, get that fire contained. She has command of the Asp Road. He set it into the handset for the whole base to hear, and then he lowered it and he looked at her and he said, quietly, just to her, The first human thing I ever heard him say. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay where the men can see you standing," she said, not unkindly, already turning toward the road. "They'll hold if they see you hold. That's your job now, sir. Hold still and be seen." And she walked out toward the bomb. I went with her because I'd said yes. God help me, I went with her. She didn't hurry. That was the first lesson and the hardest to watch. Every nerve in my body was screaming to sprint at the thing and get it over, and she walked, an even metered pace, the same pace she ran the perimeter, and she talked to me low and steady the whole way out, not because she needed to, but because a calm voice makes calm hands, and she was managing me the way she managed everything, deliberately. "We walk the same line out and back," she said. "You memorize it. That divot, that flat rock, the tire rut. If it goes bad and I say run, you run this exact line because I know this line is clear. Don't improvise. Improvising is how people step on the second thing." She meant it literally, and I understood, distantly, that where there was one there could be more, and I kept my eyes on the divot and the flat rock and the rut. "When we get there, you kneel where I put you and you don't move. You'll want to lean in and look. Don't. Your face near my hands is a distraction, and a distraction is the enemy. You are two things to me. You are a kit I can reach without looking, and you are a second set of eyes on the horizon watching for the smoke to shift. That's all you are. Don't be a hero. Heroes move." We reached it. Up close the dud was enormous and patient and obscene. A rocket, the length of a tall man, buried at a shallow angle nose down in the grit, so the fin stood up out of the ground like the tail of something that had dived into the earth. The motor section still ticked with heat. I could feel it on my face, a wrongness in the air. 15 meters past it, the ammunition pad sat stacked with its pallets of shells under cargo netting, and the burning 5-ton smoke drifted across all of it in slow, greasy banners. And each time a banner crossed the warhead, I felt my own held breath go tight, because she'd told me on the walk out, flatly, that the smoke was the clock, that the filler inside had a temperature at which it stopped caring about fuses and simply went, and that we could not see the temperature. We could only see the smoke and hate it. She knelt beside the bomb. She knelt the way she'd knelt in the mud 3 days before, even, deliberate, no hesitation in the joint. And I understood then, kneeling myself 2 feet from her with the kit between us, that I had watched this woman kneel before. That Major Deming had ordered this exact posture out of her over a boot, and she had given it to him without a flicker. And now here she was giving the same posture to a live warhead, and the 2 kneelings were the same kneeling. She did not have one self for the humiliation and another for the bomb. She had one self, and it did not break in the mud, and it did not break here. And I finally understood what I'd been looking at 3 days ago and been too small to see. It wasn't compliance. It had never been compliance. It was the same thing that let her kneel by a bomb, a stillness at the center of her that the world could not reach. "All right," she said to the bomb, to me, to herself. "Let's take you apart." She read it first. That was the part I hadn't known any human being did. I'd imagined in my ignorance that defusing a bomb was a matter of wires and a held breath and a lucky cut. There were no wires. There was a warhead and a fuse and a great deal of knowledge, and for the first long minutes she did nothing with her hands at all. She looked. She put her face close to the fuse well where it met the nose of the thing, buried in the grit, and she looked at it the way a doctor looks at a wound, and she talked, low, a running murmur that I realized after a moment was not for me. It was for her. She was narrating the problem to herself to keep the fear from getting a word in edgewise. Point detonating fuse, impact type, didn't function on the fall. Either the strikers hung or the trains interrupted. Angle of entry took the shock off axis. That's why we're alive. Motors cooked most of its propellant, good, but it's still hot and it's dumping heat into the base of the warhead, not good. Filler's going to be a cast fill. Cast fill's stable until it isn't. She sat back on her heels a fraction. Kessler, the smoke. I looked up at the drifting banners. It's crossing it again, right now. How thick, thin gray or fat black? Thinning. Pratt's getting the fire down. Good man. Tell me when it goes fat black, only then. Don't narrate the thin stuff, it just crowds my head. She went back to the fuse. Okay, okay. I'm not going to try to pull the fuse strikers in an unknown state. I torque it and it functions. We're done. I'm going to go in through the base. Separate the fuse train from the main charge. If I can get the booster out of the loop, the fuse can do whatever it wants and it won't have anything to talk to. She said it as simply as a woman describing how she'd unlock a stuck door. It's slow, it's the slow way. The slow way is the way that works. Hand me the 6-inch non-spark from the top tray. The bronze one. Just lay it in my palm, don't reach across the nose. I found the bronze wrench. My hand was shaking and I hated it, and I laid the wrench in her open palm without reaching across the nose of the bomb, exactly as she'd said, and her hand when the metal touched it was as steady as a shelf. Not steady like a person holding still, steady like a table, like a thing that did not have it in its nature to move. You're shaking, she said, not looking up, working the wrench onto something down in the grit I couldn't see. That's fine. Shaking's fine as long as it's your hands and not your judgment. Keep your judgment still. Watch my smoke. I watched her smoke. I'm going to tell you what the next 20 minutes were like. But I have to tell you first that I can't tell you what she did, not really, not the mechanics of it, because I didn't understand the mechanics then, and I've had the decency not to go learn them since, because they're not mine to hand out. What I can tell you is what it was like to kneel 2 feet from a person doing it. It was the most methodical thing I have ever witnessed a human being do. There was no drama in it. That's what nobody tells you and what I most need you to understand. There was no drama in it at all. She'd chosen the slow, safe path, and the slow, safe path was a series of small, correct actions done in the correct order with no action rushed to make up time, because the entire discipline was in refusing to rush. And she'd built her whole self, I think, over years I knew nothing about, into a machine for not rushing when every cell wanted to. She loosened a thing. She checked it. She waited, actually waited, counted, made herself and me sit inside 3 or 4 unbearable seconds, and then she loosened it further. She stopped once entirely, both hands off the bomb, and just breathed, 4 slow breaths, because she'd felt her own pulse come up and she was putting it back down before she let her hands return. I watched a woman notice her own fear and set it aside like a tool she wasn't using yet. Talk to me about you, she said at one point, hands deep in it. Not the bomb, you, where you from? What? You're spiraling. I can hear it in your breathing. Give your fear a job or it'll grab your hands. Where you from? Ohio, I said. Little place outside Zanesville. Farm. Feed store. My dad ran a feed store. Then you've counted things all your life. Count my breaths. Out loud. Slow. Give me a cadence to work to. And so I counted her breathing, out loud, low, kneeling by a bomb in the greasy orange dark, and she took the fuse train apart to the metronome of a feed store kid's counting, and somewhere in there the counting steadied me the way she'd known it would, because she'd handed me a job so my fear would have something to hold besides the wrench. Twice the smoke went fat and black, and I said so, flat, the way she'd trained me on the walk out. And both times she stopped with her hands still on the bomb and did not move and did not speak until I said it was thinning. And the not moving was the hardest thing I ever saw, harder than the working, because the working at least gave the fear somewhere to go, and the not moving gave it nowhere, and she did it anyway twice, her hands resting on a warhead that was maybe deciding whether to cook off, and her face doing the total inward nothing. And I understood that this was what composure actually was, not the absence of fear, the refusal to let fear vote. There, she said. Just that, there. The same word Major Deming had used over his clean boot was that so hard, and it landed in me like a struck bell, because she said it to a bomb she just separated from its own heart, in the same even tone, and the symmetry of it nearly put me on the ground. She sat back. She lifted something small and dark and terrible out of the grit, the booster, she'd tell me later, the little charge that stands between a fuse's small violence and a warhead's enormous one. And she held it away from the bomb, cradled, and she let out one long breath that was the first thing all night she'd done for herself. "It's inert now," she said. "The main charge can't hear the fuse, it's a heavy paperweight." She looked at me. "We still walk out slow, we still walk the line. It being safe doesn't change how we walk. Discipline's not for when it's scary, discipline's for always, or it isn't discipline." And she stood in that even way, and she gathered her booster and her bronze wrench. And we walked back down the divot and the flat rock and the tire rut, the exact line, slow, while the whole base watched from the far revetments in a silence I have never heard the like of before or since. We cleared the last revetment, and the silence broke. I don't have good words for the sound a base makes when it finds out it isn't going to die. It wasn't a cheer, not at first. It was a kind of collective exhalation, 300 men letting go of a breath at once, and then somebody did cheer, and then it rolled, and Marines were coming out of the bunkers and off the wire, and Chief Alvarin, the EOD lead, was propped in the aid station doorway with his splinted leg and his bandaged head, and he was staring at Master Sergeant Vance the way you'd stare at a ghost, and he lifted his bloody hand off his broken leg, and he brought it up, shaking, to a salute. From a chief to a master sergeant, EOD to EOD, and she saw it and she stopped and she came to attention in the mud and she returned it. And if you know what that salute meant between those two you'd have wept, and I nearly did. Gunny Pratt reached her first, soot to the elbows from fighting the 5-ton. He didn't salute. He did something that meant more. He said Stillwater again, and this time he said it to the Marines around him loud so they'd hear it. "This is Stillwater, Master Sergeant Vance. Some of you outfit, some of you were on the Kandar Road. 4 years ago. The road nobody would clear because it was seated end to end and we had wounded on the far side of it and no way across." He was turning as he said it, telling it to the crowd, and I watched faces in that crowd change, one after another as men did the arithmetic. Somebody cleared that road, on her belly, under fire, 6 hours. And when she got to the far side she carried a Marine out over her shoulders because he couldn't walk and she wouldn't leave him. That's a Navy Cross, that's her. You've been walking past a Navy Cross for 4 days. And I stood there, Staff Sergeant Wade Kessler, and I remembered the black case she wouldn't let the working party touch, and I remembered what does an attachment know about an ammo point, and I remembered the boot brush in my own hand, the weight of it. The cool, dry steadiness of her fingers when she took it, and the shame came up in me at last, full and clean and overdue, and for once I did not put it down where I put things I didn't want to carry. I picked it up. I've carried it ever since. Some things you're supposed to carry. Major Deming came through the crowd. The Marines parted for him out of habit, and he walked up to her in the churned mud where the salute had happened, and I watched the whole base go quiet again. A different quiet, because everyone there had watched him make her kneel 3 days before. A base sees everything, remembers everything, and everyone there was now watching to see what a proud man does when the ground he stood on has been taken out from under him in front of his whole command. He stopped in front of her. She came to attention. She'd have come to attention for any officer. That was hers, not his. And Major Deming looked at her for a long moment, and his face was not tidy anymore. Whatever narrow shape his idea of a Marine had been, it had a woman-shaped piece knocked out of it now, and the piece did not fit back the way it had been, and I watched him choose in front of everyone not to reach for the old shape. "Master Sergeant Vance," he said. His voice wasn't steady. I'll give him that too, he didn't fake steady. 3 days ago I ordered you to clean my boots in front of these men because I decided I knew what you were. He stopped. The whole base heard the stop. I was wrong in a way I don't have the standing to apologize for, so I'm not going to insult you with one. He came to attention himself, a major at attention before a master sergeant. I'm going to do the only thing that means anything. And he raised his hand slow, and he saluted her. An officer does not, by the book, salute an enlisted Marine. You know that if you've served. That's the whole point. He did it anyway, and the wrongness of it by the book was exactly the rightness of it in that mud, because there is no regulation for what she'd done and no regulation for what he owed, and the salute was him saying with his own hand, in the only language a Marine has for it, I made you kneel, and you are the one standing. And then, I will remember this until I die, Gunny Pratt came to attention beside the major. And raise. And then it went through the crowd like wind through wheat. The way I'd watched a laugh go through them 3 days before at the tent flap, except this was its opposite. This was the antidote to that laugh, Marines coming to attention, rank after rank of them. The men who'd been on the far side of the Kandar Road, and the men who'd only just heard of it, 100 Marines and more in the churned mud and the dying orange light of the burning 5-ton. Standing at attention for a woman, one of their officers had made scrub his boots. She stood in the middle of it, Master Sergeant Vance, Stillwater, booster still cradled in one hand, apron still on, soot and grit on her jaw, and her face did the thing it did, the level nothing that I finally, fully understood was not nothing, was a stillness earned over a life I'd never know the whole of, and she let them stand for her, because to wave it off would have robbed them of it, and she had the grace to know that too. She looked for 1 second over all their heads and found me, kneeling height in my memory though we were both standing, the man who fetched the brush, and she gave me the smallest nod. Not forgiveness, I hadn't earned forgiveness and she wasn't in the business of handing out what wasn't earned, just an acknowledgement. You walked out there. When it counted, you walked out there. It was more than I deserved and exactly as much as I could carry, and I have carried it. They held the salute until she released it. She said, "As you were, Marines," in that even voice, and the base came back to life around her, and Chief Alvarin was carried inside, and the fire got knocked down for good, and somewhere a corpsman started laughing and crying at once the way men do when the adrenaline lets go, and the ordinary machinery of a base that was going to live cranked back into motion. And I stood in the mud holding nothing, no clipboard, no brush. And I watched an ammunition point that should have been a crater sit quiet under the stars that were starting to come out through the smoke. And I understood that everything I'd thought I knew about who keeps a base alive had been exactly upside down. And that a tidy base is not a disciplined base. That discipline is a thing that lives in a person and not in a laminated roster. And that I had held real discipline in my own 2 hands 3 days before in the form of a boot brush, and had not known what I was looking at. I saw Major Deming once more that night late, standing alone at the edge of the Asp Road looking at the divot and the flat rock and the tire rut, the line she'd walked. He didn't hear me come up. He was a changed man, and he'd be a changed commander. I served under him another 7 months and watched him become someone who read his Marines for what they could do instead of how they fit his shape. And it was her that did it. 1 warhead's worth of being proven wrong so completely, there was no crawling back to the old idea. "Kessler," he said, not turning, "you fetch the brush." "Yes, sir." So did I, in a way. He looked at the line in the dirt a while longer. "Careful who you decide is nobody, Staff Sergeant. You never know whose boots you're really the one who ought to be cleaning." I've thought about that line for years. He wasn't a poet and he didn't mean it to last, but it's lasted. Careful who you decide is nobody. Because the nobody on Camp Dunmore, the attachment, the pair of muddy boots on my plywood, the woman I helped bring to her knees over nothing. She was the one thing standing between 300 Marines and a crater, and she'd been standing there the whole time, quiet, keeping to herself, taking up exactly as much room as she needed and not 1 inch more, waiting for the day the base would need what she was, and not what we decided she was. She rotated out a month later, orders finally caught up with her, the paperwork done chasing her across 3 commands. She left the way she came, 1 sea bag and the hard black case she carried herself. Half the base turned out at the LZ. She shook a lot of hands and said little. When she got to me she stopped, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at me the first day, the cataloging look, except this time I knew what it was, and she said, "You've got steady hands, Kessler, steadier than you think. Don't spend the rest of your life fetching other men's brushes." And she got on the bird, and it lifted, and the grit blew, and she was gone. I made gunnery sergeant 2 years later. I run things a little differently than I used to. I keep a boot brush in my desk drawer, Occam's old one from the coffee can. I asked for it when I rotated and nobody knew why I wanted it. I keep it there so that when some tired NCO or some proud young officer starts to size up a quiet Marine who doesn't fit the shape, some attachment with no ribbons on their utilities and a rate nobody recognizes, I can take that brush out and set it on the desk between us and tell them about a woman named Stillwater and a bomb that didn't go off and 100 Marines standing in the mud for the one person on the base we'd all decided was nobody. The realist ones don't announce it. They just keep still at the center of themselves and wait and do the terrible work when the work needs doing and let you find out too late what you were looking at the whole time. I fetched the brush. I'll carry that. But I also counted her breathing while she took a bomb apart with her bare hands. And she told me my hands were steadier than I thought. And between those two facts is the whole distance a man can travel if he's willing to pick up his shame and carry it instead of setting it down. Careful who you decide is nobody. You never know who's keeping you alive.